everyone, I'm Evelyn.
And I'm Lara. We are the host of onceuponanaija podcast, where we take you down history lane as we break down stories about people, places and events in Nigeria's past and present.
That's right, in every episode we will take you on a journey of our own discoveries as we feed our curiosity and connect with our heritage. Join us to figure out how the chronicles of the past can help write tomorrow's tale. The intro would have been playing, it would have been playing, da 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 ba 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 da 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 da.
You say hello, hello.
That's me trying to continue the intro that's been going on. I'm sounding like some really rubbish trumpet right now.
Listen, let's just jump into it. How are you, Evelyn?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Speaking of like trumpets and stuff, I'm looking in the corner. They're just collecting dust.
Are you learner? I can see that. I can see your piano. Is the piano yours as well?
Listen, my ambitions and my aspirations is just
They're
what
limitless.
you see. Yeah, no, I do have a ukulele in the corner
Yeah.
that I did start
Okay.
playing a few years ago.
What inspired you?
I've never been able to actually play a musical instrument, so I started taking lessons. This was before lockdown.
Oh wow, seems like a century ago.
I know, yeah, but before lockdown I started taking ukulele lessons. I just wanted, and it's a really instrument to start playing, so I can play a few chords.
Okay.
And then I can get people to sing along to something. I can play, what can I play? I can play Don't Stop Believing.
Wow.
I can play the chord.
Maybe for the next episode, you play us something. How about that? Show us what you got.
I'll maybe find some classic Nigerian song and play some chords for that.
That'd be nice. Nice.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the translation will quite work to the instrument, but you never know.
Listen, effort. You get A for effort.
A for effort, yeah.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I've got a guitar, which I bought at university many years ago. Well, I had to choose between a guitar and the piano, and I thought a guitar is more mobile. You can move it around with you, and all that stuff. And I had to get a left-handed guitar because I'm left-handed.
You're left-handed?
What? Are you just discovering this?
What? No, stop. This is more interesting than talking about the instrument.
What are you talking about?
You're left-handed?
Yeah. The woes of a Nigerian child.
Listen, I was just about to say, wow.
Be left-handed.
I was like, this must have been stress growing up, you know.
So now I call myself ambidextrous, not because I write
by fire,
because I use my right hand and I use my left hand. However, my left hand is more dominant. So the only thing I use my right hand for is for writing, and I believe that stemmed from when I was younger in Nigeria and in school. Yeah, you had to be, and I think everything else was just like my parents had more control of it at home, so nobody could tell me anything. Yeah, so no, I'm left-handed. And even in secondary school here, when we had like music classes and I think I was always attracted to like the guitar, and I would carry it one way and my teacher was like, this looks odd, and then she will flip it the other way, but it was just not comfortable. And I don't know how she didn't realise, Miss George Allen, how she didn't realise that actually was that her name. I think Miss George Allen was my IT teacher, but anyway, no, I think her name was Kirsty.
You're just calling lots of people out.
No, well, nobody knows what. Yeah, anyway, so she just kind of gave up on me because she couldn't but it was at uni. My friend who also plays the guitar, she was like, no, Lara, you need to get a left-handed guitar because you're playing the chords like upside. Because with a normal guitar, with a right-handed guitar, everything is like upside down, isn't it? So the way I was holding it the left-handed way. Yeah. So I was playing it the wrong way.
That is so.
Yeah.
Wow.
So then I had to get one where I could. It was actually made for left-handed people.
Hold on, but hold on. You did know that you were left-handed, right?
Yeah, but I didn't know there was a difference between left-handed guitar and a right-handed guitar. I just thought I could pick up a guitar and hold it the way everybody else holds it.
Oh, I see.
And my friend, because she had a guitar, and then I held it the way I just held it normal. She was like, no, that's
funny.
wrong.
Do you know that's so funny because I don't know why. You know how people say there's like personality trait or something.
Yeah.
Or like, I don't know, you're just giving me right-handed energy.
Am I? What is right-handed energy? I don't even know what that is.
That right-handed energy is I don't know. I think they say that left-handed people tend to be like more creative and like artistic.
Yeah.
And then right-handed people tend to be like more analytical and like lean into the critical thinking aspects of things. So I feel so, especially because you studied law and you have that background. So it's just giving me right-handed energy.
You're like, why you not a dancer? why you studying law?
Exactly. So yeah, that's why I'm.
No,
I'm
yeah,
so
no, I am. Yeah, I think I'm. Yeah, that's right. Because there's always been that perception of like creativity, especially because like I've got a few left-handed people in my family who are like very creative, like in painting and all of this, and I could never do none of that stuff. But I always thought like, I'm quite creative in my own way. Like I like to write, and even doing a podcast as a creative outlet.
Yeah, it is.
But so that's my left-handed story.
Okay.
But I have to say, I'm glad I don't live in Nigeria.
Yeah,
as a left hand. No, because even the last time I visited, I talked about this on one of my old podcasts, where the last time I visited Nigeria, which was like maybe like 2-3 years ago, and I went to this restaurant, and I mean, I'm a customer, I'm paying you for what I've bought, you should want my service, right? And then this girl, I'm sure, because me, I just wear t-shirts and jeans, I'm not looking like one, I'm not trying to prove myself, I look like one small girl. Went to the counter and paid her, and naturally, because I'm left-handed, so I just used my left hand to give her the money, and she looked at me, she was like, no, she's not going to accept it.
That is so silly.
She literally, I was like, and me, I don't like to shout, I don't know how to be doing gra-gra, like, because I feel like if you're going to live in Nigeria, you need to learn to do gra-gra, and that's not in my nature. So this girl was like, she's not taking it. I'm almost certain I'm older than her by a few years as well. And thankfully, my younger cousin was with me, and I just gave my cousin the money, and I just said, "You sort it out. I'm getting out." And I just walked out of the restaurant. I was just like, "I'm not doing this." So it wasn't until I got home, like in that moment, I was like, when I was thinking back, I was like, I should have showed her. I should have told her, if you don't take this money, I'm not living here. And I would take the food and everything. But it's like, sometimes it's afterwards you're thinking of all the things you could have said and all the things you could have done. I was like, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Anyhow. So.
Yeah, but, speaking of the energy that you need to have.
I need to have that about women's energy.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to continue talking about in today's episodes. In the previous episode, we spoke about the film 1929 and the historical fiction drama of that. But today we want to delve into the reality of what actually happened during that time. So do you want to give us a bit of background detail on that?
Yes, so just a short synopsis about the Aba Women's Riot. It's commonly known as the Aba Women's Riot, but I feel like the right way to refer to it is the Aba Women's War. Is more like the politically correct way to refer to it. So it was a war in 1929 that was led by women in the provinces of Calabar and Owerri, which is in the southeastern part of Nigeria. So it's basically like the Igbo. When I was thinking of the word Igbo, I was thinking of the way Chimamanda Adichie would say it's like Igbo women. So in the Igbo speaking region of Nigeria. And so the war was instigated, or the war started because of taxation that was imposed on the women in November 1929. And the way the whole thing sort of started was like, it started as a rumor, and the story around it was that, when the district officer, they realized that they needed to tax, they taxed the men in the previous year in 1928, they introduced taxation to that region. And then I think the following year they realized, I guess especially off the back of like the Great Depression and all the stuff that was the economic stuff that was happening in 1929, they needed more money to fund, the British government needed more money to fund different things. So how do you do that? You introduce more tax to get more, to get more money. And so in 1929, tax was introduced, and apparently one of the warrant officers who who was installed in the area as part of the governance structure had gone to like this woman. I can't remember her name now, but he'd gone to a particular woman, and he had said that he's going to count her goats and her yam and stuff. And obviously the moment you start saying to somebody you're going to count their stuff, that for that woman triggered that, there was going to be taxation coming up, I guess because of what happened in the previous year to the men. So the woman is known to have responded to the man and said, do you count your mother as well?
Yeah.
So it was quite like an insulting, for him to come and say he was going to count her yam and count her goat and all these other things. And so this kind of like sparked the chaos and the rumor that actually we think taxation is coming for the women as well. So she'd gone to the marketplace, which is usually like community of women and stuff. She'd gone there and she'd informed the market people, and the news traveled very quickly that taxation, they were going to be getting taxed. And this led the women to take themselves to the administration office and try to get confirmation of, are we going to be getting taxed, what's going on. And they'd also actually asked for the the warrant officer to be punished because of the particular way in which he because of the way he engaged with the woman,
right?
And he was actually then punished. And because they said he had, I think during the tussle that happened, he had, scruffled her up and all that stuff. And so he was actually in prison he was sent to prison for 2 years, which I found quite interesting. Yeah. So this was the genesis of the war in a nutshell. We're going to talk a bit more into like all the, the nitty gritty of what happened. But essentially the war is commonly known to have started because of the fact that taxation was imposed on the women in that region, in the southeastern region of Nigeria.
Yeah. And I think from that, I'm going to talk about it more. There are a few questions that I'm interested in exploring or discussing, and maybe those questions bring up more questions. That's and that's perfectly fine. But I think some things that I would really like to chat about with you today is like what was actually wrong with women being taxed, because you mentioned how she felt, this particular woman felt insulted that somebody had come to ask her, had come to count her her produce, etc. And then again, also you make the distinction between riot and rebellion, or calling it a war. Like, why is that important? Why do we have to be really specific about the language that we use to describe what it is that happened? And then I think more generally just about like the legacy and the impact of the Women's War. So in terms of the like why was it wrong, why was it deemed so offensive, right, to the women in the eastern region to be taxed? Because at first glance, as far as I'm concerned, I was confused and bemused by it, to be honest. I didn't really understand it, and it signaled to me that it's pointing to some, like, a deep moral offense, because especially when you think how intense these conflicts or outbreaks of violence occurred. It's like it feels as though it was a deeply offensive and deeply personally offensive thing to tax the women. I don't know what your thoughts on that, if you thought any more about that.
I think to kind of understand the significance of what happened, it'll be good to understand the cultural context as well, and the background of these women prior to colonization, and exactly what these women were fighting against. So was it purely just taxation, or were they fighting against a wider system of governance, of which taxation was one of it?
Yeah.
Right? So with taxation in particular, so in the Igbo, and obviously if any listener hears this and thinks, that's not correct, feel free to write to us and let us know. But my understanding is that within that community, within the Igbo culture, a lot of the things they do are very communal. They, as a community, everybody owns their, you own your piece of land, you have your own family, everyone kind of tills their land, whatever you have is yours. And when it comes to supporting, so like it was part of their culture where they would kind of like all donate stuff and support like one person in the community to maybe go abroad or something, and then with the hope that this one person is going to come back and serve the rest of the community. So they probably had more of a charitable way of developing the economy. So like things were volunteer, it was like a volunteer sort of approach that they had, as opposed to like imposing of, oh, you must give this and you must give that. So that's kind of like my understanding. And obviously again, the thing with like taxation, because in order for them to tax the people, they had to do a census and know like how many men and women and also like what they own. And I think there's this sort of ominous thing where it's like, oh, you don't count a man's properties, because then it's almost like you're gonna introduce evil eye to my, because like you don't want people to know what you have. So why are you counting my goats, and you're counting my sheep, and you're counting my yam, you're counting my children, you're counting all of these things? It's just not part of their culture. They don't do census like that. Yeah. Because it's just like, I guess it's kind of like a spiritual thing for them when you think evil.
Yeah, and even just a point, I feel also that there's you find that even in other like tribes in Nigeria, this idea that I'm not trying to share too much information about what it is I'm doing or who I'm with. Like you try and keep that information like close to your chest. But
So that's why I would say that's one of the surface reasons of white taxation. But then to know further why it was so important to these people is also the other things that is attached to. So the form of governance, the way, because the previous year they taxed the men, and actually what I read was when there was a census, that only in the initial census was just counting the men. Right. And at the time, they hadn't indicated that it was going to be for the purposes of taxation. Okay. So the men had been counted and all that stuff, and then tax was imposed on them. And although there was a slight rebellion against that from the men, it wasn't as solid as what the women eventually did.
It wasn't as fervent.
It wasn't as fervent as what the women eventually did. So I think eventually, because of that initial kind of suspicion and what they'd seen done to the men, I guess naturally they felt that, okay, this counting you're doing is only going to lead to one thing. And so I felt like they were revolting against taxation, but they were also revolting against the colonial way of governing them. Because again, in this community, men and women had their own method of like governing each other, and
it wasn't like the roles of men and women. It's really important to understand that the way Europeans divide labor or understand gender roles is completely different to the cultures in the Eastern region. It's not the same. Like women had a lot more agency. The contribution they made to their community and wider society was actually valued in a way that it's not valued in European society.
And I guess this is one of the downfalls of the colonial era, where not just in the southeastern part of Nigeria, but even in the western part as well. Like, so like for the Yoruba tribes, we've talked in a previous episode about Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, and just like the role that women also play in that community. So with the colonial introduction, they also try to enforce like certain gender stereotypes, like this Victorian view of like what women should be like and how they should conduct themselves, etc. So this was not happening within this cultural context for this women. So you're introducing indirect rule, and also with the chief warrant, or the warrant officers rather, that they introduced to implement this taxation and to enforce the taxation. In that culture, they're not used to one person just being lord and master over everybody.
It's really, in Igbo culture, it's a republic. That's the governing structure they have. So it's whereas this is centralized, like one one person is dictating from monarch all the way down to
and what that also enables is that it enables corruption and dysfunctionality where so much power is concentrated to one person, because that was also part of the things that the women were complaining about, in addition to the fact that they were being taxed, is the fact that this warrant chief and the native court system that they had, they were largely corrupt and dysfunctional because there wasn't that input from the community and everything. Exactly. And it was just it was top down as opposed to a more kind of system. So the imposition of the warrant chief system and all of that, the political failings and economic slum, and also again it was just that the women were also feeling the economic, because I think you'd mentioned previously about in the wider context of the economic happenings in the world, which 1929 the Great Depression and stuff. So like palm kernel, I think that's how you say it, was one of it's almost like how oil is like a massive commodity, that was discovered in Nigeria in the 1960s. Like palm kernel was a massive commodity that was used for a lot of things, in the West by Britain and just generally. So like palm kernels were used for like soap making, they were used for like as lubricants and stuff. So where you've got the Industrial Revolution and they were using this oil for all of those things, so there was an inflation of everything, things were costly and the women were not getting enough. They felt like they were not being well remunerated for their produce that was being used. So I think to simplify the women's war as just because of the imposition of taxation, I think it would be to like overly simplify the war. And it would be really good to kind of look at to acknowledge the wider context of it.
I think additionally to that, I think the other reasons you mentioned about the anti-colonial nature of the protest and the revolt are really important, because what is so often done and something that I naturally do when reviewing history and especially reviewing colonial Nigeria is I'm looking through it with a post-colonial lens, and it's very tempting and easy to try and place these women in a narrative that is implying or giving them a different reason for revolting than what they actually wanted. So I think there's an essay actually that you shared with me, written by Emma Davis, and who studied this point in history, and she highlighted in her essay that some anti-colonial or post-colonial writers make the mistake of trying to say that these women were protesting to try and bring about they were protesting in light of wanting of nationalism.
Yes.
And it can be easy to do that, especially when so many of the writings were made in studying that time during national where there was a movement for nationalism. Thank you. There was a movement for nationalism, but I think that's something that is really important to stem away from. I think you mentioned in the previous episode as well, yes, there's women empowerment, but actually the women's empowerment does not necessarily equal feminism, or it shouldn't be codified as that. And so I think with this protest or with this vote, it's making that distinction between, yes, they were challenging the colonial powers at the time, but not for the purpose or reason of we want to, unite Nigeria, or we want to see Nigeria united against the British. It's more, if anything, it's anti-colonial, yes, in that we don't want the British here bringing in their form of governance, but it's to the degree of we want our Igbo culture, we want our ethnic culture, we want to govern ourselves the way we have historically governed ourselves. And I think that's an important I think that's an important nuance
Yeah.
to the conversation or review of this period of time, because I tend to do that, and I tend, well, actually, I don't tend to do it often. I'm quite reticent is the word, I think, or reticent anyway, to put on, to give political philosophies to women of a certain period of time that we would experience today, which I think people tend to do. They tend to look back on in history, and people want to look at, like, for example, in one of our first episodes, Queen Amina, feminist icon. It's like, she wasn't a feminist icon.
She was just doing what she did.
Yeah, she just doing what she had to do, you know? So that's something that I always, like, want to avoid doing. Yes, we may use that language, but it's not what they would have not necessarily...
They were not thinking in that line. And that's a really important point that you've made, because one of the stuff I read, and which I kind of agree with the line of thinking, is about the, you know, when the protest has been written about and talked about, they talk about the way the women protested naked and the sort of like nudity that they unleashed on the British, on the colonial administrators, and how this was quite a shocking thing for them, because, you know, their views are shaped by this image of like Victorian femininity, as, you know, as opposed, that is really confined within like domestic space and, you know, tangible fragility, and, you know, but these are women who are like traders, and, you know, they're very active and involved in the community, and they're coming and they're really being outspoken, and that's just who they are. It's not because I guess with like feminism, it's almost like this it's almost like there was a shift at a time in history where women, like where British women or Western women revolted against the molds that they were being, you know, put in, and this created this whole thing. But then you have this community in other parts of the world where it's like, this is how we've always been, and this is who we've always been, and so you can't, like you've rightly said,
put that narrative
around them. And and you know, I'll just read out something that was written that I read, where it says, the excess of bodily forces that this nude female warriors unleashed nevertheless could not be comprehended by colonial administrators whose ideas about gender were shaped by the Victorian image of femininity as confined to domestic space, fragile, and thus in need of male protection. So it was just like really hard for them to comprehend. And I think when you were asking the question earlier on as we started about, you know, this language of like riot and rebellion, like, is there really a difference? You know, is it worth making a distinction between the two? And I think to a large extent, although both languages kind of seem similar in essence, it's like, okay, a rebellion, a riot, a war, it's like all one and the same. But I think in part of the literatures that I read, they try to make a distinction in the way that the British try to form this narrative of like riot, where a riot is almost more like an illegitimate form of protest, like, or, you know, like a violent, illegitimate, has no basis, has no moral standing, as opposed to like a rebellion. Because if you use the language of rebellion, then the focus would then be on what is it they're rebelling against,
right?
What are they rebelling against? And so it shifts the focus back on actually the instigator of the rebellion, as opposed to the people protesting the whatever it is. So yeah, I think there's a slight difference in that. Yeah, it kind of like took the British were able to kind of have a moral covering for themselves by using the language of riot as opposed to a rebellion or a war. That's kind of like how I think it is, and some of the other narratives and some of the other writers have you know, framed the conversation in that way as well. And I think there is something to it, because, you know, they always say that the victor in any history is the one who's just, you know, the person who gets to write the history. Really, they write it from their own lens, and they get to tell this story how they want to tell it.
Yeah. But what I really like and what I'm encouraged by is the fact that, you know, these rebellions, these wars are being studied and they're being taken seriously, and the fires, the I was going to say pleadings, but that sounds a bit like powerless. But the what the demands of these women are being taken seriously, and that these women are being recognized as legitimate points of interest in their own right.
Yeah.
And not just, they're not, you know, a paragraph in somebody else's story, but this is the culture. They are interesting enough to be studied. And I think what I'm interested in again is learning more about what this frustration, this anger says about the beliefs and traditions of the tribes in that area. That's what piques my interest more, actually. If anything, the colonial discussion and narrative not becomes boring, because I think that always needs to be investigated. But really what we want for ourselves is to understand ourselves more and understand ourselves better. And I think more and more these days, whenever I'm reading post-colonial like papers or anything, I really want to. I think there was a time when I was interested in post-colonial theory and papers in and of itself, rather than being interested in the subject matter. But I'm using, you know, the papers that we've read in preparation for this episode really as a way to ask questions about who are these people, and why are their traditions and cultures important to them? What is it about the thing that they're protesting against? What does that say about their beliefs, their system, the way they view the world, how they understand true and right things? That's like a far more like exciting and interesting thing for me. So, but those of our listeners who from the tribes in the region where these women were protesting, like, please let us know, like, why was it such an abominable thing for women to be taxed?
Yeah. And I think even the name of the, you know, it's been suggested that the name of the war itself is quite misleading, because it says the Aba Women's War, but it limits the geographical area for the war to Aba, but it was actually like there were Ibibio women, it covered quite a large geographical sphere. So now some people just refer to it as the Women's War of 1929. But so speaking about this women and their legacy, really, like you've rightly said, because it's actually worth just studying them on their own outside of the colonial narrative that is being imposed sometimes. What do you think are the legacy? Like, firstly, what was the result of their protest? Was it successful? Did they achieve what they set out to achieve?
I think in terms of, I suppose when I think of legacy, that's an interesting question, because as mentioned before, people view them with a lens that tries to fit them into a united Nigeria like story. So I feel as though I think one of the sad things is that their actual story and their demands have been like co-opted into something that wasn't necessarily there. So there's some like agency that's been taken from them, which I don't like. But in terms of what the women actually achieved, I think it was impressive, because they and the tactics they used to protest. So one example was that they would sit on the men, you know, or they would take the cap from, I think they took the caps of the warrant officers. I think, like, reading about the tactics that they used and quite frankly the violence that they used, and reading some of the comments from the commission papers that followed on from the riots in 1930, and their determination and resolution in saying that if we are taxed, we will fight to the death. They were quite explicit in stating that we're not afraid of death. You know, like, you're not going to tax us, and that is just so impressive. And it tells me and reminds me that that women in Nigeria, they really do set pace, you know. Like, they really do. They really do. They're just a force to be reckoned with, and you can't take them lightly. And actually, that we have to, I think for me, one of the lessons from reading about this is that we have to consciously put away what our assumptions are about how patriarchy works, or how gender roles work, or just how, like, men and women are viewed and what their contribution is to society. And actually remember from moments like this in history that we're not docile, and we're not, our own culture respects us. Our own cultures value our contribution. And so we shouldn't let this posed ideals determine the way we interact with one another. Like, let's not, it's been disturbed, let's go back to it and review it.
And I guess so you make a really valid point, because that just kind of like I was casting my mind back to a few years ago, where, you know, I was reading about women in the Western culture, maybe back in like 1800s and 1700s and all of them times, and just like it, for me, their lives were just so different from what I knew of, like, because one can fall into the trap of just viewing womanhood as this kind of like one thing. It's like, oh, all women are like this, and it's really important to understand the cultural context in which the women that you're talking about, or wherever in the world that they live in. So where you have like British women in the Victorian era, or wherever, where, you know, some of them they didn't work, or they were just meant to be home and look after the children, and I was just like, no, like, even in Africa, from my understanding, and even from the little that I know of in recent times, the women, even if they were mostly at home, they were still doing some sort of trade from home, and they were doing stuff. So for me, when people try to fit in this whole kind of like Victorian femininity and stereotype of like what being a female should be, I do feel like sometimes there's a lot of like Western imposition of like the Western female. And even though now we're, you know, I don't know what to say, fortunately or unfortunately, because like the westernization of everything means that the similarities are just getting closer and closer. So it's and like
we're adopting it more.
We're adopting a lot of westernization, whereas now it's not very different to actually say what is us and what are the things that we're actually adopting from the West. But going back to speaking about the legacy of these women and what they achieved during the war, so we know that they were not just fighting for themselves, they also fought for the men as well. But I think, you know, the taxation of men continued. However, the British came to realize that actually they couldn't tax these women, and so that led them to drop in their plans of taxing the women. And so in that sense, one could say that their protest or the war was successful. And also, again, like we said, it wasn't just a riot against taxation, but about the powers that the warrant chiefs that was delegated to the warrant chiefs. And because at the time women were not put in those positions, so eventually they had more women who were being, you know, put in this position as warrant chiefs, and there was sort of more, I wouldn't call it democratic, but it became
more egalitarian.
And so they kind of like had to find a middle ground, I suppose. I don't know how successful it was eventually, but I think in the immediate term they were able to at least be satisfied And, you know, because the war was quite short term, it was like between November 1929 to December 1929. However, the aftermath of that, you know, the kind of reinforcements and the ongoing development and introduction of better system was ongoing for many more years after that. But yeah, so it was really, it was a powerful event, and it's a really noteworthy one, you know, to talk about. And yeah, we're glad that it came into our views, and we've been able to discuss it. Yeah. And hopefully now there's someone out there who knows more about the Aba Women's, well, I call it Aba Women's, but the Women's War of 1929, which happened in the southeastern part of Nigeria.
Yeah, so I'm very glad to learn about this point of history. I'm glad you made us watch the film.
If you haven't watched the film, in case you've just jumped straight into this episode, you know, do listen to the previous episode where we reviewed the film 1929, which was an attempt at, you know, storytelling about the event, and let us know what you think.
Yeah, but I'm glad, to have learnt more about this and just taking a moment to remember that these women are worth studying because they are worth, you know, studying. So I'm glad we're speaking about it. I hope our listeners are glad that we're speaking about it.
And I hope you will share that, you know, share the episode if you've enjoyed it, if you found it useful, informative, spread the news.
But thank you for listening.
Thank you. Until next time.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye. So guys, thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it and learnt a thing or two.
Yep, you can find our episodes on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to keep up with us in between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram at onceuponanaija.
You can also find links to some further reading and information about the episode's topic in the show notes. If you want to encourage, collaborate, or as I like to say, support the ministry, drop us an email at onceuponanaija@gmail.com. Bye for now.
Bye.